All too often, many people will associate complexity to the key element of replayability when it comes to a game. Because if it takes a very long time to figure out what's going on, surely that game must be replayable. But as we have seen with many developers experimenting with unique concepts and designs, it's not so much complexity that determines a game's lifespan, but the depth or the affordance of depth when it comes to the gameplay itself. Now, many video games, as we've talked about before, strive for that infinite replayability. The game you just want to keep coming back to again and again and again. Your Civilizations, Crusader Kings, and even stuff like The Binding of Isaac, and obviously the big example right now, Fortnite. But when it comes to any video game, regardless of how it's designed, there is an inherent limit built into the mechanics. And the term that gets thrown around a lot, especially by game journalists, is the Chick parabola. This was coined by game journalist and owner of Quarter 3, Tom Chick. And in a Civilization 4 review, he talked about how the longer he played Civ 4 and the more he started to figure out how things work, the less interested he was at continuing to play. And while that may sound very weird to some of you, this does raise a very interesting discussion when it comes to just how much depth there is to a mechanic or a game system. Now, when it comes to most video games, you're not designing a game around 500 to 1,000 hours of gameplay. You're trying to get as much out of the mechanics as you can, and there is a varying amount based on the design in question. A game like Civilization or Crusader Kings definitely, at least at first glance, has far more replayability than something like Mario or Sonic or Castlevania. But in order to look at things closer, we need to see just how much there is to these mechanics and how much you can really grow or test the player with them. And when it comes to a lot of video games, this is where people will conflate complexity to depth. That just because a game takes 50 hours to even understand what's going on, surely means that game is deep. But good game design gives the player something that they can easily grasp and then allow them to grow things out from there. Now, we're going to switch to some game footage in a minute, but before we do that, we've talked about this concept before in terms of the lifespan of mechanics, and it really comes down to two key factors. The first is how much can the player actually do with it. For instance, if you have just one simple jump and there's no other way to control it, then that is very limiting. But when we look at games such as the Mario series and even 2D to 3D, Nintendo does a lot in terms of creating a lot of different ways for the player to use Mario. You have double jumps, triple jumps, wall jumps, spin jumps into wall jumps into triple jumps, and you get the picture. The other point is how much can the game actually test or make use of these mechanics. And this is a big part that we see in a lot of puzzle-based design, whether it's its own unique system within a game or being just a puzzle game itself. If the rules of your puzzles, let's say, only has 3 or 4 possible outcomes or ways to solve it, then that means that no matter how many different puzzles you design, the player will still be doing the same 3 to 4 things, whether it's 10 puzzles long, 1,000 puzzles long, you name it. This is why, for instance, that a lot of people like myself like the puzzle design of a game like Infinifactory by Zachtronics, wherein a lot of the complexity is built into trying to figure out all the different ways you can make use of these very wide mechanics, or very deep. But with that said, let's jump into some game footage of a title that, again, while it may look simple, does a lot to keep the player invested without necessarily growing things from a mechanics standpoint. And now a quick shout out to the supporters over on patreon.com/gwbeister. Super Meat Boy by Team Meat and famed indie developer Endon McMillan is a great example of being able to build depth and variety, not so much on the player's side, but more into what the game asks them to do. Now, Meat Boy here has very simple mechanics. He runs, he jumps. That's it. But his velocity is dictated by the momentum that he carries when he runs and jumps, and even how much the player holds down the jump button as he moves through the air. Instead of trying to add in new moves and systems, Edmund followed pretty much the same suit as Mario. That Mario's moveset doesn't change. Mario doesn't unlock rocket jumping or teleporting. Instead, the game throws more and more interesting challenges at the player that test their mastery of Meat Boy's mechanics in different ways. As you can see right here, we're about to do some very careful wall sliding in an enclosed space. Other areas will require you to make blind leaps of faith, sometimes very careful jumps like what you're going to see right here, which I just failed right also. But again, the point is that the game space is deep enough to warrant these different aspects or different tests. This is the same thing we see with Mario and the rise of the Kaizo community. If you don't know what we're talking about, a lot of Mario Maker and speedrunner fans or players have taken to the Kaizo community or ROM hacks. These are games that may start with the same basic foundation as Super Mario World, Super Mario Brothers, and so on, but will quickly differentiate themselves with unique challenges and designs that were never seen in the original run of Super Mario, or never taken to this extreme. Some of the best Kaizo hacks will actually implement new challenges that were never even thought of before until these hacks. And again, Mario's moveset, for the most part, or from the majority of these hacks, is not expanded on. They don't give Mario special abilities, he gets no unique powers. Instead, it's just about saying, this is what Mario can do, now what are all the ways that we can just utterly crush the player by testing them? And there's a greater talk to be had about difficulty, but that's beyond the point for today's video. But when it comes to games like those Kaizo and Meat Boy here, again, what the player is doing is not changing. Instead, it's just about adding in more elements and more things that will basically add more depth to the environmental obstacles. In the very first world of Meat Boy, we had moving platforms, we had buzzsaws, but we didn't have it at this level. Also, what I'm showing you right now is from the final world of Super Meat Boy, so another thing to keep note of is that these levels are noticeably longer compared to the earlier worlds. That's another element of being able to test the player with essentially the Grand Master form of these mechanics and systems. So it can become a little bit more frustrating, and this is why you need to pace things out. Like, imagine if this was just World 1 of Super Meat Boy. It would probably throw a lot of people off before they got their feet wet. Now, getting back to our main topic, again, about how games kind of fall away despite having a lot to do. One of the examples I turn to would be something like the N++ or the N series, where despite featuring hundreds of levels, the player doesn't really change all that much, whether in terms of what they're able to do or what the game throws at them over the course of all these levels. There's just too few environmental and enemy hazards to keep the player invested. Again, the beauty of something like the Mario games is that there's a very rich canvas of things you can throw at the player, from water levels to lava to flying to doing shell jumps, which has become very popular among Kaizo and Mario Maker levels, which we never really saw in the original version. But you get the point. There's enough depth not only to the mechanics, but to what the environment or what the game can test the player, that it creates these variety of options. But the issue that I ran into with N++ is that it got to that point where the same missile launcher behaves the same way every time, just like the same Ghost Ninja or those Thomp-like enemies. So even if there's 100 or 200 levels, it still all boils down to the same basic elements, and that becomes very tiresome. And again, back to the point, it gets to that situation where once the player has mastered the game and there's nothing else to throw at them, then they're just going to stop playing. But the worst thing is if your game, if the mastery occurs, let's say hour 5 of hour 100, what else is the player going to do for the remaining 95 hours other than being bored by the fact that there's nothing else for the game to teach or show them? So, with that said, we're going to wrap things up here. For you watching this right now, can you think of games that did a really good job of having a very simple curve or complexity curve, but giving the player all matter of challenges and things to test them? And can you think of games that just could not maintain that sense of growth and depth over how many hours it takes to beat it? Let me know in the comments below, but thanks for watching. If you'd like to suggest a topic for another video, let me know. But that's it, so be sure to come back for more discussions here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoy things, be sure to do all the liking and subscribing that the kids are doing these days. Check out our Discord channel link down below where we hang out and chat game design, and come back later tonight for our regular streamings. But that's it, and tune in for more great content here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games.